very much tied to that is this idea of distortion, which is that especially for students, very often they see the product, like what they're creating or working on, as really the purpose of their education. Like, I'm here to create this thing, to write this paper.
The world needs a lot of grade 9 essays.
That's exactly what I was going to use. We need 140 grade 9 essays on the fall or whatever it might be. No, we don't, of course. But we want you to think through, these questions or this book or whatever it might be. And but I think that ChatGPT, insert the tool here, can subtly reinforce that by quickly giving you the thing that you're trying to produce, whether that's written form, whether that's music, whether that's a visual. And it, again, can distort the purpose of your education, which is already, frankly, something that many students miss. They just, understandably, want to get from one class to the next. But this tool, especially when deployed thoughtlessly, can really reinforce that. So those two, I think, work in tandem, disrupting the learning process and distorting the ends of the education.
Welcome, everyone, to the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by John Brahier at Longbeard. If you haven't heard of Longbeard, you may have heard of Magisterium AI. Longbeard is, I guess you'd call the parent company of Magisterium AI. And we're here to talk about AI and Catholic education. John, welcome to the show.
Brett, it's always good to see you. Thanks for having me today.
So our audience won't know this, but we recorded this podcast already in, I don't know, what was it, October or something. And then you wrote me and said, a lot has changed since we recorded it and it hadn't been released yet. In particular, the Pope has written a new document aimed at Catholic education that discusses AI. And so we should redo it. Like, what are we going to do? So just a heads up to everyone, the first recording, I'm going to mine it for some content and make some publicly facing stuff out of some clips from there. And then we'll have the full version of it in the back room behind the paywall at Substack. But we're not going to concern ourselves here not to repeat ourselves. If it's appropriate to repeat ourselves, we will repeat ourselves. We're just going to have the conversation, but in our new context. And maybe, after the first preliminary, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, because I forget that, they don't see that you've already done that. Then we'll jump into Pope Leo, who's kind of like the AI Pope, and this new document. But first, who is John Brahier and what are you doing?
Yeah, thanks, Brett. So a little bit of background. I was trained in math and theology, worked in Catholic high schools, teaching both math and theology, was a director of campus ministry, associate superintendent for the Archdiocese of Detroit, and all in did just under 10 years, either working in or around Catholic schools, and then got connected with Longbeard, which, Brett, like you said, is a Catholic AI company. Really, our area of focus is on building AI at the service of the church. So that involves everything from app development, like you referenced Magisterium AI. So everything from that level to data work. So, for example, we have a hub in Rome that we are using to digitize manuscripts from the pontifical universities. So we have about a half dozen or so of them that we're working with to digitize their manuscripts. And at the same time, we're working on the algorithm side. So we're developing a Catholic language model that we want to be the foundational Catholic AI, so that folks in the church know that they can trust whatever's happening beneath the surface. So that's the scope of work at Longbeard. My own background is in Catholic schools, Catholic education. And so at Longbeard, I focus on the educational world. Everything from how can we use AI ethically in classroom settings or as teachers, as students, which is a really challenging topic, to actually educating, like, what is AI? What is this black box that we call AI? All the way to research work. So academic research, looking at the impact of AI, and particularly in our space of Catholic AI on the spiritual lives of people who use our tools or others that exist. And so, yeah, you mentioned some of the changes that I emailed you about. It's a wild space to be in because things change so quickly. And so,
right. And we're not recording this again. Like, between now and when this comes out, I don't care what happens. We're putting this on the market. Anyways, yeah.
Well, we just got to make sure we beat Pope Leo's encyclical, if indeed he is working on one.
Right. Well, we'll record part 2. Yeah. But anyways.
Part 3, right?
Or yeah, who knows? Yeah. So Pope Leo from I would say before he was elected. I mean, I think it's clear that he was talking about AI in a way that the cardinals found compelling. I think at least part of his election was because the cardinals felt like this was a man who could speak to the church in this moment. It goes back all the way to 2012. He made a intervention in a I'm not going to have the right word, at a meeting. There's a meeting in Rome where he made an intervention, and it wasn't on AI yet, but it was on things like social media and that sort of thing. And it got a lot of action back then. And he's been seeing this relatively clearly as anyone. And I think the Cardinals said, in this moment, this is a guy who understands this and can speak to this. And then, of course, he referenced it in himself in explaining his name of choice of the name Leo, that Leo the 13th, the most recent Leo, was the lead of the church's response to the Industrial Revolution. And now we have another analogous kind of revolution upon us, and the Pope has to be able to say something. So in a certain sense, he's kind of the AI Pope. And as you mentioned, it's widely expected that we'll get an encyclical on AI. Hopefully not before this goes to air. But he has recently put out this document, Drawing New Maps of Hope on Catholic Education, in which AI features. So why don't we start with, what did he say? What's going on in this new document?
Yeah, even just to back up a little bit, to go back to your explanation of the timeline, which was really well said on your part, Brett. He really struck me with his comments that he made to the College of Cardinals after he was elected, when he explained exactly like you described why he chose the name Leo. And I'll never forget, I was in my front yard and somebody texted it to me, and I was just skimming through my phone reading it. And it felt like, for me, that he was actually speaking to me at that moment, which I know he wasn't, but I really felt God working through his words and doing something in my life, making me realize I'm called to some role in this new world that's being created, or new version of the world that's being created. So that address was really actually impactful to me on a personal level. But I think you're right that Leo seems to have an incredible understanding of the moment that we're in. And I'll give one more example of that, and I promise we'll get to Drawing New Maps of Hope, but your setup there really made me think of this. So our company hosts and helps to put on a forum in Rome called the Builders AI Forum. And the concept behind the forum is to bring together theologians, educators, investors, basically people across the spectrum that are interested in Catholic AI, to have conversations about how should we build this? And really, frankly, should we build this? And they're really interesting conversations. So Leo didn't attend, but he did send a letter to us. And then he tweeted about the forum on the second day. And the reason that this was really important to me is that what happened was, one of the really well-known tech giants in the AI space, the secular AI space, I'll leave him nameless for right now, but he retweeted Pope Leo and did so actually mocking him, making fun of his point. So basically his point in the post on X was something to the effect of, builders of AI, I call you to build with human dignity, solidarity, justice in mind, things like that should have been fairly basic principles. But the secular AI giant retweeted mocking the Pope. But what happened was, actually, after that, was very instructive. The secular AI world turned on him and ripped him to shreds online, to the point where he actually had to go and delete the tweet, which I'm sure there was some part of that was a residual just respect for the Pope. But I think at the same time, the driving force behind that was that there was something true about what the Pope was saying. And even the secular AI world knows that there are some topics that AI is almost infringing on that are inherently philosophical and theological. And so that whole sequence of events, the Builders AI Forum, the Pope's tweet, the response, and then the response to the response, was a great reminder to me that the church has an incredible voice that is very much needed in this time. And that's why we can't shirk from the moment, right? And I think that's what Leo brings, is this awareness of the moment that we're in. So with all that said, Drawing New Maps of Hope. Um, yeah, it was a document that was released in October and uses an incredible metaphor that we don't have to dive into, but he wrote about Catholic schools as a constellation, which I love because there's a unity in diversity that is present in Catholic schools that is also present in a constellation. They're unique stars, but together they make up some united thing. And I think that's true about Catholic schools as well. It doesn't mean we all have to look exactly the same, have the exact same philosophy, but we do have to have the same goal in mind. But what he spoke about in terms of AI and digital technology, I thought was a helpful spectrum. So he encouraged schools and those involved in schools to avoid at one end the extreme of technophobia. And on the other end, he didn't use this word exactly or this phrase, but a digital reductionism that basically reduces learning to the acquisition of facts or particular skills, and argued that Catholic schools and educational institutions more broadly need to avoid those two extremes and find what the middle ground might be, which I think is a really compelling way of viewing the kind of AI landscape. And I think what's important, and what was important to me, was in reading those two opposite ends of the spectrum. Let's start with the technophobia side. That could be read as, okay, technophobia is associated with getting rid of digital technology. So the Pope is saying, don't get rid of digital technology. Therefore, he's saying we should have digital technology, which
right. And
is
one
not
to
necessarily
one,
the right stream.
starting
right?
in kindergarten. Yeah,
Right, exactly. So, and I don't think that's what he's saying.
Right.
But what he's speaking to is what the mindset needs to be. We can't make decisions like this out of the principle, with the principle being something as simple as digital technology is bad, therefore we shouldn't have screens in any classroom. Like, that's a simplistic and unhelpful mindset. And the same is true on the opposite end, right? It's not necessarily about the result of where your discernment lands you, but about the starting point. And that's where the technophobia and digital reductionism, I think, are helpful contexts. They should inform the actual discernment process. And yeah, they'll ultimately indirectly inform where we land. But I don't think we all need to land in the exact same space, but we need to start with those two extremes being avoided. So I thought that was a really helpful contextualization.
I think there's something about a Catholic attitude towards technology in general that's being applied in the particular here. I've done some work on like gene therapy, for example, right? And so the same basic responses are available, right? Like techno optimism, like gene therapy will fix all the things, right?
Right.
And then on the other hand, like gene therapy is in itself evil and destructive, and we should never do it and whatever, right? And the Catholic vision of technology more generally is technology is part of the human call to stewardship of creation, and it's basically good. It's also incredibly powerful, and whenever something is incredibly powerful, there is the potential for very dangerous misuses. So I think that's like one kind of first layer. And then the second layer is Catholicism rejects this idea that technology is neutral. Like, because in what I just said, you could still have this sense of like, it's neutral. It's just, do you use it well or do you use it poorly? And if you look at any like YouTube videos, somebody under the video said, technology is neutral. It's just, you can use it well or use it poorly. And there's like something true about that because you can use it well or poorly. But what the popes have said, Pope Francis said something like this. I wish I knew exactly where, but he says technology is never neutral. There are things about technologies that lead in certain directions, and if you're not aware of what it's leading towards, and now we all know this, right? If we were naive before social media, we shouldn't be naive now.
Right.
If you
Right.
thought social media was just neutral and you could use it well or poorly, and then you had kids and you saw what happened to them and their relationships and their thinking and their whatever, never mind what happened to yourself. It's easier to see it when it happens to other people, right? It's the logic of the thing has its own momentum. And if you're not aware of that, you're much more easily going to use it poorly and have it misused upon you. So I think a general Catholic approach to technology has at least these two layers. Technology is basically good, though could be used for great evil. And it's not neutral, but the platforms or the technologies themselves lean in a certain direction. And we should think very carefully about what those directions are, right? If we're going to use it well.
Yeah. No, and I think what you're referencing from Pope Francis was the G7 summit address that he gave in June of 2024, where he talked about the spectrum of technologies ranging back to the knife, which is a non-interactive device, but still a technology in a sense that could be used for good or ill. And he draws a sort of through line from that to artificial intelligence, but then, of course, makes the caveat that there's something different about artificial intelligence compared to the knife. And that's where, again, later on, he draws out this idea that, yeah, it's not entirely neutral. And so operating with that mentality is probably not going to be useful. And that's actually one of the tendencies, that's been heartening to me, especially as I watch Catholic schools as they grapple with artificial intelligence. I think especially in the iPad era, so to back up maybe 10 or 15 years, there was, especially in the United States, a widespread adoption of one-to-one devices that was frankly in a lot of cases done just to mirror what was happening in public schools. Oh, the school down the road is adopting a one-to-one program of some sort with Chromebooks or iPads or whatever. To stay competitive, we need to do that as well. And now 5, 10, 15, now maybe 20 even years, and depending on the technology later, we're realizing, oh, maybe that wasn't the best idea as we're trying to get phones out of the classroom and we have these kids effectively with a huge phone in their hands anyway. So right. I think we've learned lessons from that, which is very heartening to me because as I'm watching Catholic schools as they grapple with artificial intelligence, not to downplay how tricky it is, but I think that just the attitude of not ignorance, but of intentionality is super important and frankly not something that we've always done. So that's been heartening for me to see. Now, we can't let the intentionality turn into like sluggishness. And I think that's what we almost risk if we don't really intentionally walk. But I also think that a slow, calculated approach is better than a rushed, like, let's just adopt and figure it out next year.
Right. I've noticed a lot too, Catholic educators being very intentional in ways that and not just we Catholics. I mean, the public schools are more cautious than they were 15 years ago around social media too, because everyone has learned their lesson that rushing into this stuff because we so easily see the good that it could do and so easily overlook the evil that it might do. And I think educators in general tend to be optimistic types. You know, it's like education is a future-oriented like thing, right? Like we are building the future. That's what we do in education.
Yeah.
Right. So it's very easy for advances to technology to map onto that basically optimistic building the future sort of thing and rush into things. And what we've seen with devices and social media with young people in the last decade or more has introduced a real note of caution, Catholic or public schools, that has led to, I think, a lot more thoughtful conversation around AI than I remember us having around social media and devices 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Though how much our intentional conversations can actually work as a bulwark against the sort of crashing waves is another, question.
True.
But
yeah, and I would add maybe an asterisk on your educators are optimistic comment. As a former educator, that was very much true in August. But once I hit maybe mid-November, there's maybe a slightly different mentality of like, oh man, Christmas break is a month away. So no, but generally I think that's correct. Like to be an educator, you have to be future focused, right? I think from a meta level, like ignoring what the technology can do or should do or any of those questions, what gives me most hope right now in the kind of initial AI years is seeing schools that are realizing like, hey, we could just adopt this AI technology. We could bring in whatever this platform is. But before we do that, maybe we need to step back and actually ask some of the fundamental questions about what's the purpose of educating here, and really stepping back and having conversations that, frankly, we don't need to have every time a new technology is released or a new program comes out or a new edition of a textbook comes out. But we all do need to be on the same page about these very basic questions about what's the philosophy of education here, what's our vision for where students are going and how we help them to get there, what's our understanding of our role versus the parents' role, not versus, but like along with parents' roles. And that's what's giving me most hope right now, again, outside the technology itself, but that the tech has almost forced that conversation to happen in some ways.
Right.
And so when schools ask me, like, where should we start with unpacking AI or some version of that, the answer really is that you need to start without even talking about AI. You need to talk about what is your philosophy of education. And if you follow those conversations to their natural end, which is very difficult to do, you will often find that they lead to, oh, wow, we're doing a lot of things in this classroom, in this school, that are actually not relevant to the real ends that we have in mind, which is a little bit of a terrifying thought, right?
Right.
But I'm given some hope by the fact that this is almost forcing that conversation to happen, at least
Right.
in places where it wouldn't have happened otherwise.
I'm gonna ask you about drawing new maps of hope right after this, but just one thing that's come up. So I wrote my book before AI was a thing, but of course, wherever I go, there's questions about AI because it's the thing that there's questions about. And there's one of the key themes in my book is education is about formation, not information, and there's a few other principles, but that one really stands out as this when they're thinking, what are we doing here? Why are kids coming here? What's our hope for the end of this? Is it that they know a lot of things, right? Is it that they're jam packed full of facts? And everyone knows that that's not why. But how often do we teach, or do we have things marketed to us to help us teach as if the goal was to pack people full of information?
Right.
But if the goal is to form certain kinds of people, then that question applies very precisely to AI, right? What does the interaction with this technology do to me? Who do I become in this engagement? And if that's the frame, I think that's a very helpful framework for assessing if I incorporate AI in this way or that way, or at what age, or all the particular questions. If in the background there's this question of, I'm trying to form a human being, or we're trying to form a human being, what does this do in the shaping of this person's character and virtue and imagination, et cetera, right?
Well, yeah, and I think that's the natural place back into drawing new maps of hope, because that really speaks to the digital reductionism, like that tendency, this idea that learning can be reduced to a mere acquisition of facts or of pieces of information, as if there's no context or formation outside of intellectual formation or training that's necessary or a part of education. And yeah, Leo and Francis and many others have spoken quite eloquently about the fact that any AI has to be done in the context of an existing student-teacher relationship, which is, again, easy to say, but it's really hard to unpack what that actually means when AI can and has been demonstrated in some circumstances to be impactful as a tutoring agent. So, like, what does that mean about the role of the teacher then? And so that's where at least for me, I've pointed even before drawing new maps of hope to give myself some context for, like, what are the conditions upon which any AI usage should be predicated. And if you draw back to Antiqua et Nova, so this is another document from the church from, I think it was January of 2025, which is wild. That was almost a year ago.
But still in the Francis.
Still in the Francis era, yes.
Pontificate, correct. Right.
Correct. Yep. Yeah, so the Francis Pontificate, yep. And it was published by two dicasteries, and I don't remember which ones off the top of my head, but it was a wide-ranging document on AI that did a really nice job unpacking what is AI, what distinguishes human intelligence from artificial intelligence. Had a really nice line about the kind of the nature of artificial intelligence as created by human intelligence, which I think is a really helpful framing. But what I really liked about it as a former educator is that it spoke briefly but directly to the educational world. And it gave a really nice if-then statement, where the second half of the statement was about how AI could be used well, which sometimes that part of the sentence I saw get quoted without the like conditional if at the beginning, which is the most important part. Because if you don't do the ifs, then the thens are, can't be achieved, or at least are much less likely to be achieved. And so there were three qualities that were conditions that were listed in the if part of the sentence. And those were a prudent manner. So it required judgment, right? In the context of a teacher-student relationship, and oriented towards the proper goals or authentic goals of education. And so those to me have been the framing ideas for whenever I get past the, okay, have you figured out your philosophy of education conversation? Those are the three things that we point to. Okay, how are we using prudence in determining which tools, not even AI, but like which tools generally we're using? are they being used in the context of an existing student-teacher relationship, and are they actually oriented towards the goals that you've articulated? Like, those are the conditions that we need to start with before we can get to the hype of personalized tutoring, or personalized feedback, or we'll use a voice mode to debate and prep for a conversation in class, which are all great things, but unless they're predicated on those three conditions, they're very likely to lead a student and a class astray, I think.
Right, right. And this goes to the idea that it has its own logic that is pushing in a certain direction. And so if you don't set up these parameters, it won't be simply neutral in its impact, right? And I mean, some of the things that we're already seeing, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, because teachers are talking about this all the time. We're already seeing the outsourcing of thinking, which seems to involve like dead spots in brain scans from heavy AI users, right? Or like this sense that like I actually can't do anything. Like I have a task and it's my normal procedure to ask my preferred AI engine, a little bit before I make a decision, and like to feel like I can't actually make a decision without this like voice on my shoulder, like the kind of almost infantilizing. Right. If you think, I mean, this happens all the time. I might have used this analogy last time we talked, but it was the cab drivers in London used to take great pride in the fact that they had a part of their brain that was overdeveloped because they had memorized London as like a geography. The map of London was in their mind, and in order to be able to do that, you actually change the structure of your brain. And I realized when I had a GPS in my car and I moved back to Regina, where I had gone to undergrad before GPS was a thing.
Mm.
And I realized that driving with this GPS in my car, I was forgetting the geography of Regina because I was dependent on this thing. So I just took it out and got rid of it. And then I would, in the odd time when I didn't know where I was going in Regina, I'd look at a map or something. But it would build on my existing knowledge of the road maps of Regina, because I actually felt myself getting dumber by outsourcing that part of work that my brain used to be able to do on its own. And like AI seems to me like that idea on like steroids, that you just outsource all thinking to the point where you can't even recognize almost what thinking is, right? That you couldn't differentiate, as you mentioned in the document, between human thinking and AI thinking. Like we would reduce our sense of what thinking is to what AI does, instead of recognizing like humans can have a relationship with truth. And if AI has a relationship with truth, it's accidental and predicated on good programming. It's not that there's a machine that can know and recognize truth from falsehood in itself, right?
Right. And that's one of the points that Antigua et Nova makes, is that one of the distinguishing capacities is the pursuit of truth, right? That grounds the human person. I think bigger picture, though, it's worth noting any technology, every one, comes with some set of losses and some set of gains. Like, even to go more fundamentally than the cab driver example or the GPS, is the car itself, right? Pre-car, most of your life was spent in, or at least a large portion of your life on average was spent in your community. And to get out of your community required a great amount of work. That was accelerated by trains and other forms of transportation, right, certainly. But the car really revolutionized that. And you could certainly argue that there was a breakdown in the local community that was tied to the car, because it's much easier to escape your community at that point, which is good and bad. And like the car has allowed many great things. I get to go to the Rocky Mountains very easily now, 24 hours or whatever the drive is, but relatively speaking, pretty easily. But there are trade-offs, and like every technology comes with some sort of cost. And like you said earlier, I think that even 20 years ago, when you and I were younger, we were less willing to entertain. I don't want to speak for you, but many of us were less willing to entertain the conversation of what is the cost of this thing. Right. And I'm glad and heartened to see this conversation around what are the costs, because there are some great things, but we also need to count the costs. And so maybe it's a good time to speak to in the educational world what I think are some of the possible costs that we at least have to be aware of, that maybe aren't guaranteed, but we need to be aware of.
Right.
And I'll start with the most fundamental like the deepest one to me, which is what you referenced, this idea of cognitively offloading our work. And it speaks to this idea of it can speak to this idea of mirroring, which is one of my big concerns that I have, not just educationally, but certainly in the classroom. And basically, the idea of mirroring is not that AI is going to continue to do a better job mimicking human interaction or speaking or whatever it might be. That is true. That is going to happen. But rather that, as you referenced, we're going to start looking at that as ideal and striving towards that, even subtly. This has already happened in other technologies, like many, many times over, right? This happened with the Google search engine autocomplete. There's a lot of research that shows that even just the suggested words that show up in autocomplete on Google have a huge impact on how people vote, how they live their lives, the choices they make. And that's certainly true with AI. And there was a study that came out of Florida State, I think sometime within the last year, but it looked at non-scripted podcast conversations pre-ChatGPT and post-ChatGPT. And basically what they measured is the frequency of word usage, again, pre and post the release of ChatGPT. And what they found, probably unsurprisingly, is that a group of words that were mostly associated with higher rates of use in ChatGPT were then reflected in non-structured conversation style conversations like this in podcasts, again, post 2022, which suggests that not only were people reading ChatGPT and internalizing it, but then it was impacting the way that they spoke.
Right.
That is a huge thing that we need to pay attention to. And again, this is not the first technology, and it will not be the last technology where that reality is the case, that there's a mirroring. But to us at Longbeard, like that was one of the fundamental ideas that grounded the company. Was certainly OpenAI is not building ChatGPT with a Catholic worldview. It's a relativistic data set, like scraped from the entirety of the internet. It's actually fundamentally incoherent, right? Because you have many different ideas bouncing off of each other. And so part of our concept behind Magisterium AI was, let's build something that is coherent and, for us in the church, at least oriented in the right direction, which is a very difficult thing to do. But if this technology is going to exist, that's how we might harness it, right? But that's the first category for me, is the mirroring.
Let me ask you something about the mirroring. So this, one of the things that I found interesting with ChatGPT, that's the one I'm most familiar with, is it's got a real humility built in about like making claims about the nature of reality, right? It will sort of say like, I don't have an opinion on that, or right, which in one sense is good, right? Like, because like in a certain sense, the worst case scenario is like the programmers have an explicit worldview,
right,
and they're going to communicate it through this thing. And so it's a massive brainwash operation, right? Now, maybe it is in some ways, but I think it's consciously trying to avoid that, which I think is good. The flip side, though, what we end up having instead is it thinks that everything I think is awesome. Right. And so there's a handful of exceptions. And one which is really interesting is that AI seems to be really good at debunking conspiracy theories, which is a fascinating, and maybe that's a little side conversation, which I think is really interesting. But outside of the debunking, and I've tested it on this, it's actually pretty good. Like I tried to say I don't want to get vaccines because of autism or whatever, and it pushed back on me. But the vast majority of time, it doesn't push back. It says you're the best. You had such a great idea, and it fits in exactly the way that you thought it would fit. And so then what ends up happening is like you're in an echo chamber with yourself.
Right. It's even worse than social media in that regard, right?
Right. Like no social context at all, but just this thing telling you back to yourself what you already believe and how great you are for believing it and whatever else. So, which is not what I would have initially considered a problem. Like I was initially grateful that it allowed me to be a Catholic theologian with certain commitments, and it wasn't going to fight with me about those things. I'll ask it to like stress test some arguments or positions I take, and it can do that. But even when it does that, I have to be really mean. I have to be like, be a real jerk to me. Because it even initially when it stress tests, it's like, well, I would try to stress test, but you're just so smart. Stop. But anyway, but the reverse problem was not immediately apparent to me, that it would just feed me back myself improved, improved by whatever metric. Which strikes me as kind of, I don't know, is it the inverse but it's something like the mirroring. Like instead of us imagining ourselves and measuring ourselves on AI, which is one kind of problem, we also have this like AI showing us ourselves and repeating us back to ourselves kind of thing. Which is, subtle at first, at least.
Yeah. And I think just to push a couple of those ideas even further, and I'm not going to be able to quote you because I'm not you, but you've often used this idea that no curriculum is neutral, right? And I think the same could be said of ChatGPT. Like it's not neutral. And that's actually what is, I think, at times very concerning is we know that these technologies are not neutral, but it's hard to know what the bias is.
Right.
And it was interesting as many of these tools first launched 2-3 years ago, it became very quickly clear what the biases were, and they were able to cover that up. And now it's a little bit less clear, right? And again, for us at Longbeard, like it's pretty obvious what our bias is. Like we tell you we're a Catholic AI company, so at least it's out in front of you.
Right.
But I think there is bias built in. There's a group called the Gospel Coalition, which is a Christian group that put out what's called a benchmark, and they looked at, I think it was the 7 most popular large language models and assessed them according to their alignment with a Christian answer to the most commonly Googled questions about Christianity. It was absolutely fascinating. But one of the things that they found was that not only was the content at times wrong, and again, this is where it reminds me of your work, the content at times was wrong or misleading, but it was also the context or the way that things were described that was very, very subtly misleading. Because there's a huge difference between saying God created whatever and saying the Catholic Church teaches that God created. There's a very subtle relativism that can be hidden in that second statement to basically pitch what the church teaches about that is like, oh, that's one of many perspectives. So they call this out very directly in their work, which I think is really helpful because, again, it's very, very easy to miss the bias, so to speak, if it isn't like directly told or communicated to you straight up.
Yeah, no, it's the way that it forms our image of ourselves and our relationships that we barely notice happening until something like this comes along and points it out. And then all of a sudden you have the lenses to see the thing that is obvious after somebody says it. Like, I don't know that I recognized that it was just mirroring me back to myself, although I felt like uneasy, but I didn't have the language to describe the experience, which I think is right. Like we're all having new experiences by interacting with these tools that are like weird. And then someone else my wife articulates, she just makes fun of me because it always says how great I am. And because it's replacing my wife as my proofreader. My wife has been my proofreader for 2 decades and she is more direct in her critique.
Yeah.
than Jet. So she could see that part very clearly, right? And she could kind of mock me for it and whatever. But it makes me wonder what I'm losing by not having now she still does some proofreading for me, but it's just one more example of this subtle shift. But you were starting on maybe a list, I feel like, and you had mirroring at the top of the list. So let's keep going down the list.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. So in my other concerns in the educational world, so mirroring is really the deepest one that I have, but the two that are like tied for second, I guess you could say, are distortion and disruption, which are very closely related. But the way I describe a disruption is that often in the education process, to put it kind of bluntly and without much precision, iteration is a huge part of learning, right? Whether that's in writing, it's the drafting process. Whether that's in math, it's looking at patterns and sequences over a period of time to discern and draw out like what's happening here. There's often a process that takes place that actually is the learning process. And what the excessive use of generative AI tools can do is it can really reduce the number of iterations. And that's where the real learning takes place. And as a result, it can cut short the actual brain development that is core to learning. And so that disruption of the disruptive capacity is deeply concerning. But very much tied to that is this idea of distortion, which is that especially for students, very often they see the product, like what they're creating or working on, as really the purpose of their education. Like, I'm here to create this thing, to write this paper.
The world needs a lot of grade 9 essays.
That's exactly what I was going to use. We need 140 grade 9 essays on the fall or whatever it might be. No, we don't, of course. But we want you to think through, these questions or this book or whatever it might be. And but I think that ChatGPT, insert the tool here, can subtly reinforce that by quickly giving you the thing that you're trying to produce, whether that's written form, whether that's music, whether that's a visual. And it, again, can distort the purpose of your education, which is already, frankly, something that many students miss. They just understandably want to get from one class to the next. But this tool, especially when deployed thoughtlessly, can really reinforce that. So those two, I think, work in tandem, disrupting the learning process and distorting the ends of the education.
I think it takes the distortion of the ends of education, which we have already largely unconsciously taken on, and pushes them to their logical conclusion in a way that forces you to ask the question in a way that maybe you haven't before. If we understood that the goal of this class I'm taking at university was to write this essay, or in grade 9 to solve this math problem, or whatever it was, hold on, I have to solve a bunch of math problems throughout my school career that the world already knows the answer to.
Right.
So it could never have actually been the goal that I finish this math assignment and give the world the answer that it already has. The goal had to be that I became the kind of person who has done this and can do similar things, right? The formation of me was the goal of this math assignment or the writing of this essay.
Yep.
But what we end up with, once AI can make the music and the art and the film and write the essays and the opinion pieces and all that, okay, now it can do all the things better than we can do. Okay, and now what are we going to use them for? What are these things for? We don't even need humans to make movies and music anymore. So now we don't need humans, but we have music and movies for who? Like the whole apparatus of human culture comes into question when it's like, so we could just step to the side and let AI do all the things and sort of resign our position in the universe. And then if we weren't here and AI just kept doing it, what does it mean, right? I think it forces us into the reductio ad absurdum, right? What does it mean if AI can do the things? Then it means that producing the products was never the actual goal in the first place, right?
Especially not at the K-12 level. I think once you get into graduate studies or beyond academic settings, very often the product is what you're targeted towards, right? Or what you're aiming towards. But yeah, especially at the K-12 setting, like that is just almost always the case. And I don't know how far we want to go down this rabbit hole, but I think that is very much accurate. And I should add the fourth concern that I have, which frankly, I don't know if it is worth as much time as it often gets, but is the concern around academic integrity. Plagiarism, cheating, certainly is much easier with these tools. This is often the first concern that gets thrown out in educational conversations about AI. And I understand why, because as a teacher, like, you want to ensure that what you're teaching students is actually being, digested and understood and wrestled with, and tools that can, again, disrupt or distort that process. Pretty concerning. But to me, the deepest concerns far outweigh the concerns about academic integrity, which have existed for many years. And again, so have those attitudes, right? The attitudes of, I'm just here to produce something, just get the paper done and turned in, certainly pre-existed AI. I just think it's hyper present in the AI era. And if we've learned anything from the last couple of years, the AI detectors that exist are just not worth their salt in most cases.
They can't keep up.
They can't keep up, right? And I think if we're playing this game trying to catch kids cheating by using AI, like we're in the wrong pursuit.
Right. Well, it's obvious that this is going to be the first question, because the first thing the teacher has to deal with once AI came on the scene was these essays look weird. What am I supposed to do about that? Right. So it's obvious that that's going to be the first problem.
Yep.
But when you think about it, it actually leads to better thinking about the other problems.
Correct.
Right. Because then it's okay. So why am I doing this assignment in the first place? If last year they hired an essay writing factory in Nigeria to write it, and this year they just got ChatGPT to write it, they still have the same fundamental attitude towards what we're doing here. They're just using a different means. But this is sort of forcing us to say, what are we doing here and why?
Yep.
And then it leads to very practical questions, which I think we can spend a little time on at the end here, which is, so then how do you use it well, right? So using it to write your essay is, I think, universally agreed not well, although can it do certain tasks once you're at a certain stage of essay writing that don't undermine what you're doing? But my kids are chess players, my two oldest boys, and chess is one of the places where AI had its early wins, right? Because it's this very circumscribed set of problems. Once you know the rules, you can do whatever. And most of us probably remember when Deep Blue beat Kasparov, right? Which was this sort of like man versus machine. And something that happened that was really important, which is very much what you mentioned in the Vatican document from Pope Francis's pontificate, is like, it wasn't just a machine that beat a man. It was a bunch of humans who built a machine that beat a man, right? And that's an important thing to recognize.
Yep. That's just hard to put in a headline.
It's hard to put in a headline.
Machine beats man.
Right. But what we've learned from chess since then is not that the fact that now every chess game in your pocket on your smartphone could beat Magnus Carlsen doesn't mean that humans stopped playing chess or that chess became a meaningless task, which is one of the initial concerns. In fact, human chess has learned from machine chess, and humans are doing interesting things in chess that we weren't doing otherwise. But in a world championship where the machines are not playing the game and the two best players in the world are going head to head, they're playing a different game that is in fact an improved, like it's an advance in the understanding of chess because of the interactions we've had with the AI engines that are really good at chess, right? So that's a positive vision where the human goal has been maintained, and in fact, the human capacity has been increased by having AI as a partner, which in my mind, that's a fundamental difference. AI as a partner where the humans learn is a very different situation than AI as a replacement for humans who don't have to learn anymore, right? And I wonder, when we're, as classroom teachers, we're trying to think about when and how to use AI in teaching. I think that's a fundamental distinction. Does the use of it in this case make the person more capable of the thing that we were trying to make them capable of, or less, right? If you do a debate and someone preps with an AI engine the night before, but they have to stand and deliver with no AI assistance on the day of, well, that could work very well.
Right.
You could do better than you would have without the AI. But if you're just like, well, we're just going to have the AI stand in for me and your AI stand in for you and let the AIs debate, well, then let's just not bother getting out of bed in the morning.
Right. Yeah. And I think maybe to add one more comment on the chess note, I think that in other domains of life, yes, AI is going to replace some components of script writing or the artistic process or whatever it might be. And at the same time, as it could enhance human work, it's also going to make human work much more valuable, which I think is like a counterintuitive response. But it seems like the proliferation of the AI slop has made high quality human generated or human created work, frankly, even more valuable. And I pause on that word. I misspoke there because I do think that semantic distinction is helpful to make, that AI can generate and humans can create. Maybe that's a semantics game, but I find that to be helpful. Sister Nancy spoke about this at a conference I was at earlier in the fall. Sister Nancy Usselman, I think is her last name. But I like that distinction between generation and creation. But back to your question about the kind of effective use case, I think the argument that I hear most often from folks that are really critically thinking about AI in education goes something like this. in the United States and other parts of the world, but they're typically thinking about the United States, pre-industrial revolution, much of the educational world, at least significant portions of it, were done in tutoring sessions. Maybe not one-on-one, but small group settings. That wasn't scalable. Post-industrialization, there was a scalability of how do we get classes to have 30, 40, 50 people and do education en masse. But now we have, with the advent of AI, the ability to do personalized instruction in the context of a human relationship at scale. That's the argument that some will make for the place that AI fits in this kind of progression of education, looking at the last, let's say 150, 200 years. I think the questions that really we need to start by wrestling with include some of the ones we've already listed out, right? Which is what's the philosophy of education? We have to start there. Those three conditions from the Antiqua et Nova note that I referenced earlier. And then, again, this is going to sound so simplistic to say this, but what is the actual problem you're trying to solve? If you're a student, if you're a teacher, what is the problem? Because, again, this goes back to instead of just blindly adopting a technology, let's think about what we're trying to address, what problem we're trying to get around or solve or unpack, and then find a technology or something that helps us to address that. And so if your problem is X, then we might go to Y. And I think that just by adopting AI, we miss that whole conversation. What is the problem you're trying to solve?
It's a solution looking for a problem.
Bingo. And so for us at Magisterium AI, the problem was access to church teachings. Great. Let's digitize 30,000 of them, and we're going to keep growing that. Digitize 30,000 of them, and then create a platform that's going to point people to those documents over and over and over again so that people can find the wisdom of the church that otherwise would be stuck in a library somewhere. And there are many other technologies like this that are designed to solve a problem. But the AI platforms that I see that are most often leading schools astray, and I don't necessarily want to get into names here, but some of them are not designed to solve a problem. Again, they're designed as a solution that's seeking a problem, and as a result, it's just creating problems in the school.
Right. Well, we've got maybe 10, 15 minutes here. Let's think practically about two questions. One is how students should or shouldn't be using AI in school. And then part two is how teachers should or shouldn't be using AI in school. And you made a distinction earlier that I think maps onto this, which is with the students, they're generally not producing things because we needed this problem solved. Right? They're going through these exercises because it forms them into a certain kind of person. Whereas the teacher is doing a lesson plan because the world needs a lesson plan. Right? So that's a very different. And so I think their relationship with AI is different than the student in that regard. If they're using it to produce a lesson plan, well, we actually needed a lesson plan. And if it can help us make better lesson plans and more efficiently, blah, 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 well, that's a certain good. Whereas helping us to get a better essay more efficiently skips the educational process, which was the point, and the product wasn't. So I think that's a fundamental distinction that might come into play as we think about this. But let's start on the student side.
Yeah, and even just to push back on that premise a little bit, though,
okay,
even the AI lesson plan generator, there's been research done on some of the different platforms that has suggested that they revert to a very traditional style of lesson planning, of teacher-centric lesson planning, which for some folks is totally fine. But for others that are looking for a more engaging, student-centric version of a class, they find that these, sometimes, AI lesson planners will revert back to a traditional style. Why is that? Well, guess what? The lesson plans
in the data set?
Exactly. Were largely traditional. So I still think it's worth pointing out that even in the teacher space where the lesson plan is part of what they need to produce, there still is that concern about mirroring, about what are we subtly building in that we just need to continue to be aware of. But all that said, so to focus in on the student side, you referenced without calling it out earlier, your brain on ChatGPT, the study that came out this past summer that looked at writing over a process of multiple groupings. And they had basically, the study had one group of people who were allowed to use ChatGPT, another who were allowed to use Google or some sort of search engine, and then another that was just no technology, just use your brain. And they gave each group a series of writing prompts. And what they found over time is that the group that performed the best, that retained the information the best, was the group that had no access to a search engine or to an LLM. And that's pretty much what got the headlines from that study. However, there was a point at the end that got missed in almost every single report that I read on it. And it makes sense. The paper was over 200 pages long, so it kind of got buried at the end. But what they did in the very last part of the study is they took the brain-only group and then the large language model-only group, and they flipped them for the last iteration of this. And so basically the group that had been allowed to use a large language model for the last prompt that they got, they were no longer allowed to. And the group that had only just been relying on what they could come up with up here was given access to a large language model. And what they found is that the LLM group that had it stripped away, their results plummeted because there had been an over-reliance on this technology.
Right. They had training wheels. Correct. You took the training wheels off and they just fell over.
Didn't know how to bike.
Right.
Whereas the other group actually accelerated even further because they had developed the right pathways of thinking that allowed them to write effectively. And then when they were able to put a tool on top of that skill set, it supercharged their ability to write. The problem for student use is that very infrequently as a student, do you have the actual understanding of where your brain is in the developmental cycle? And that's why the role of the teacher is so important, because the teacher knows that that's not going to be the same place for all 30 students in this classroom, right? So it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be 2:05 p.m. every Thursday afternoon. It's really student dependent. So it requires the teacher being involved and observant, but it requires the teacher knowing what are the fundamental skill sets that a student has to have before we can leverage outside technologies, whether that's a calculator, whether that's an LLM. And I'm not saying those are the same things, but similar ideas that there are fundamental skill sets we need to build in. And then we can use technology to do really, really exciting things. So while it's easy to say that, I do think the burden for student usage of AI largely falls back on teachers and parents, which is knowing, again, what are the developmental skills that are required at a baseline, and then where do we layer in some of these other technologies, whether that's AI or something else. So while that's still a general answer, I think that is part of what needs to happen. Like as a math teacher, what are the fundamental skill sets that when I'm just talking to a student, that student needs to be able to say, or at least needs to be able to understand here before we start layering anything on top of that.
Right, right. I read a book, you may have seen it, called Co-Intelligence. Have you encountered this book yet?
Yep.
And one of the really interesting things in the book is he references something like this, that the people who get the most out of LLMs are people with a broad education.
Yeah.
People who know how to ask good questions. People who know how to make careful distinctions. Because if you think about what kind of a skill AI prompting is, right? It requires basically a broad what used to be called like a broad humanistic education, right? And so people who've read a lot, who've had, deep dive conversations that are just thinking about the world, who are making distinctions, all those kinds of things made them very effective users of LLMs, right? Which maps onto exactly what you're saying. So he was thinking, another step, which I have not heard a lot, which is in a world where LLMs are going to be a big part of life, what education do we give kids that maximizes their ability to bring value to that or get value out of it, or both? And it was this much more broad, because specialization gets less important when LLMs can specialize all the way down to the narrowest kind of thing. I'm not saying we're not going to need specialization ever, but it was very interesting that a broad education with philosophy and theology and literature and history equipped people for better engagements with LLMs than like a deep dive into biological chemistry or whatever right. Yeah. So I thought that was a fascinating thing. And the second thing that came to my mind as you were saying this is parents and teachers have to make these calls. I was just reminded when I train deacons how to read in church, there's always a question about how fast you should read. And what I say to the deacons is no one in the history of church has ever left a service and said, the reader was too slow. Right? Like, so whatever you're doing, go slower, because even though it sounds awkwardly slow to you, that's not how it sounds to the congregation. They always complain that people read too fast, and they never complain that people read too slow. And why do I bring that up? You can probably see where I'm going. If you have to make a judgment about when to introduce this, my gut says the odds of you saying I waited too long before I really gave my kids a lot of AI versus the regret on the other end that I said I gave it to them way too early, I would bet that the distribution is something like the people complaining about how slow the reader was at church. Very few teachers and parents are going to be like, we waited too long to immerse them in AI, but a lot of people are going to say, we got them in too early.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that especially, this is true in the education world, but it's also true in other sectors. The general tools like ChatGPT are very useful for a lot of reasons. But again, in the education world, we have a particular set of problems that require a particular set of solutions. And we have to be very careful about applying a general tool to a particular set of problems. And it speaks to, if we're going to be using AI, so to speak, just to put it kind of broadly, we should be thinking very specifically about what's the problem, and then what's the specific technology that was actually created to solve this problem, or at least can solve it. Because applying a general tool opens you up to so many other things. And that's, again, what I've been glad to see schools not doing, is saying, oh yeah, like, let's give our 8th grade students just broad access to ChatGPT. Horrible, horrible idea. And I think everybody realizes that.
Let's finish by thinking about the teacher now. So in the work I do, I help teachers try to, at least part of it, I try to lay theoretical foundations, but then teachers, being the most practical people in the world, say, I need something I can take home. So one of the things we do is we have workshops where we generate ideas, and I have a series of prompts that we use to generate ideas for how I would integrate Catholic faith with nutrition and food groups, or the 5 senses, or dodgeball, or like whatever, like things you do in class, right? And wouldn't you know, large language models are pretty good at brainstorming, right? And they'll come up with lots of ideas to put in here. And so one of the things I say in the workshops is, don't pull out your phone right away. Actually let your brain work for a while. The phones are going to be good at this. But don't outsource your thinking and become an automaton on the one hand. But also the phone, every idea that the LLM has, at first blush, it thinks is a good idea. But not all of its ideas are in fact good ideas, and you're the professional here. You're the human, and you're the responsible person. There's the moral thing. If you just give them what ChatGPT says, and it's not great, whose responsibility is that? Well, not ChatGPT's, yours, right? So I think it can be a very valuable tool in lesson planning or unit planning. It's a great brainstorm partner. But even as I myself use it for those things, I notice myself skimming, not engaging deeply. And I've seen it where teachers come up with an idea in a workshop from a large language model that's a great idea. And then when they move towards execution, right, they move out of the brainstorm phase into the execution phase, they're really lacking in the execution phase because the brainstorm phase did not involve enough of their own ownership of the idea. It was a great idea that could be executed well if you had some skin in the game, but you don't.
Yep.
You haven't done the work of integration yourself. And so now, even though it's a great idea, it's going to come across as really hollow when it's presented because you've skipped a few steps, right?
Yeah, and I think that's spot on. When I use Magisterium AI myself, I find that the most useful part of it for me is being directed into the references, because otherwise I find myself too easily slipping into I'm just kind of skimming the summary, as opposed to, no, I actually want to go read what Pope whoever from the 1300s wrote about this, at least a paragraph of it. And so I think for that specific idea of brainstorming, again, as the former math teacher, brainstorming, how do I more deeply imbue a Catholic worldview in my math class? Sure, the summary that Magisterium AI gives about a few different kind of big picture ideas might be really helpful. But if I can dive into particular writings of saints that otherwise would be very difficult to find online, or frankly, ChatGPT would have a hard time pointing me directly to the actual source, like that's where some great utility can be found. And again, if we go back to this idea of what is the problem we're trying to solve, This is a thing that we're going to use to solve that problem. That's where I think, again, just speaking to Magisterium AI, it could be useful. But I very much relate to that idea of it's very easy to get caught in the, I just kind of skimmed what Gemini or whatever it was told,
Right.
as opposed to digging deeper. And in some ways, it's the same problem from, I don't know how many years ago, but Wikipedia, right? Like, we read the Wikipedia summary before Wikipedia was legit, as opposed to just go to the bottom of the Wikipedia page, find the links, and then go read the articles and like the original sources.
Right.
Which, again, for us at Magisterium is everything needs to be referenced. Everything needs to be able to point users, people who are using our technology, to the actual sources. So that's been part of it for us. Has been, let's make sure that that's all there, because for me that's been the greatest utility there.
Right. I've seen a slide presentation, a slide deck that teachers made with an AI tool. It was super impressive. It did a really great job. Everything it said was like the way I would have wanted it said. Like I would give it like 90% plus as a way of articulating the thing. And it looks super professional, the images, all this kind of stuff, right? But then when the teacher goes to teach it, if they don't actually know the stuff, now they're reading a text, which is a good text. I was happy with the quality of the text. But now they're standing at the front of the classroom reading a text that they don't have expertise in, that they couldn't explain. If the students had deeper questions, the teacher would struggle to explain it. And so this super exciting technology that did this thing that is really amazing. Like, how did it build that thing that this would have taken 2 weeks for me to make this PowerPoint, and it made it in 30 seconds, right? Okay, that's amazing. And now the product that the student encounters is a teacher reading from a screen about something they don't know a lot about.
Yeah, and frankly, that's where we need to start by asking, what is the problem I'm trying to solve? Likely that teacher already has a really well-developed and pedagogically sound lesson to deliver to students, but in that case, probably just doesn't have a good set of slides to accompany it, right?
Right.
Or has like a pre-PowerPoint set of slides, like the actual slides.
Right.
What that
overhead projector.
Overhead projector, exactly. What that teacher needs to do is to take his or her lesson plan, go to Gamma or any of the other like PowerPoint generators, copy and paste it in, and it'll generate slides based on top of your lesson plan. Now, you haven't offloaded the actual thinking and design and kind of secret sauce that's gone into your lesson plan. You've just offloaded the visual that's going to enhance the student experience. So again, it's about figuring out exactly what is the problem that you're trying to solve. Efficiency is not always the answer. It's not always what we're shooting for, especially not in education. Education is often messy, and it requires relationship. It requires thinking with people. We can't offload the messiness at times. But that's what AI promises, is efficiency all the time. We just have to be very careful about what we're efficient about.
Right. Well, I was thinking about the relationship, like that. This was one of the three things in the three items in the list that you mentioned earlier. And maybe this is a good place to finish, because this is fundamental to education more generally, but Catholic education specifically is communal and relational. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I mentioned this last time we talked, but I watched a video from the fellow who does the Veritasium YouTube channel, Derek Muller, mm-hmm. and it was on will AI revolutionize education? Mm-hmm. And what he did in the course of this presentation was he walked through a series of news headlines from when radio came out. And when radio came out, it was going to revolutionize education because you wouldn't even need teachers. You could just have the world's experts delivering lectures from MIT and Harvard and Oxford and wherever by radio to students in classrooms across the nation, or maybe even at their homes. Schools will be obsolete because we have radio. Because it's a content delivery service, right? And then the same thing happened. He showed it with TV and with MOOCs. Remember MOOCs,
mm-hmm.
right?
Wow,
Online platform, right?
Yeah.
Right? In every case, it was going to be a revolution because of content, because of an advance in content delivery, right? Which misunderstood education as content delivery. And so if we understand AI as more efficient content delivery, we're going to have the same thing that we had in the past. And what he said was, maybe the reason that none of these things led to the revolution that was predicted is because we already have the fundamental best practice, which is what's the word I want? A mentor, a teacher, a leader, and a group of people sitting together and having a conversation.
And
right.
I think one other historical example is worth pointing to, which is the printing press, right? Because the printing press resulted in job loss, certainly. There were people whose lives were dedicated to copying texts. It resulted in massive pedagogical shifts. Prior to the printing press, a significant portion of your studies were literally copying texts, or at least portions of texts. And that began to be replaced with the printing text. There were massive shifts in pedagogy, in work realities. And we did okay. The printing press helped us in a lot of ways. So even if it does shift the way that we do some things, again, as long as we keep the fundamentals aligned, that's okay. Like, things are going to change over time. And I think that's the technophobia that it risks falling into technophobia, to say, oh, everything's going to change, therefore we need to not do it, not engage in this conversation or step away from it, which again, I think is the fundamental mistake. Let's keep the skepticism, but let's engage with this idea.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think he was a technophobe.
No, I think I don't want to attribute that to him either.
Yeah. But I think he was saying, if we keep this fundamental thing, this technology can help in different ways. But if we imagine we're replacing this fundamental thing, or if we don't even notice what the fundamental thing is and we misidentify something else as the fundamental thing, then we're off the rails. Right. And that goes back to a lot of what you've been saying, right? Force us to think about these big questions. What are we trying to achieve here? All this kind of stuff. John, it's always a delight to see you and to talk with you about these things. I'm so glad you're out there doing the work you're doing. Where can people find you if they want to learn more?
Sure. So they can find our company at longbeard.com. Unfortunately, none of us actually have real long beards, but it is longbeard.com.
Get to work on that.
I know. It's a time-intensive process for some of us.
Right.
And then you can find Magisterium AI either online at magisterium.com. You can find it in WhatsApp or just in the App Store or Google Play. And that's our flagship app that we've developed.
And John, are you working with schools and dioceses on these questions if they want to get a hold of you to do that kind of conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So people can reach out to me via email, just john@longbeard.com. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm not cool enough to have too many other social media accounts, but those would be two easy ways to get in touch with me.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure you'll hear from some people because this is the question I'm getting wherever. I'm starting to do a little work on it, but you're the real pro here, and it's such a live question in Catholic education, and I think you've got some stuff that's very helpful for people. So thanks again so much for being with us. I'll just finish by letting the audience know this podcast is hosted on my Substack, even if that's not where you're encountering it. So if you want more Making Every Class Catholic goodies, go to the Making Every Class Catholic Substack, where there's a monthly newsletter. That's free. And then, as I mentioned, behind the paywall, there's goodies like podcasts that never got published, among a whole bunch of other things. In fact, I'm starting to write my next book. I'm serializing it behind the paywall on Substack. I just came up with the table of contents the other day, and there will be an appendix on AI, but the book is not on AI. But anyways, so check us out over on Substack. And John, thanks so much for being with us. God bless you.
Likewise. Thanks so much, Brett.